the hardest walls to cross are the ones nobody else can see. Those were the words echoing through my mind as I stood beneath the bright lights of the community center, my fingers intertwined with Claire Sullivan's while a room full of strangers waited to see whether either of us would let go first. Cameras flashed. Conversations faded into whispers. Somewhere in the back of the room, a little girl smiled as she rolled across the polished floor in her wheelchair, completely unaware that the project we had spent the last year building had become far more than blueprints and budgets. It had become the story of two women who almost convinced themselves that love was impossible. If someone had told me 12 months earlier that I would willingly stand in front of an audience with my heart more exposed than it had ever been during my 23 years as an architect, I would have laughed politely and returned to my drawings. My life had always made sense on paper. Measurements could be verified. Steel either held its weight or it didn't. Doors opened because someone designed them to. People, however, rarely followed plans. I learned that lesson the day I lost my husband 6 years ago, and ever since then I had quietly rebuilt my life around routines instead of dreams. Every morning began with black coffee, a 30-minute drive through downtown Boston, and another day creating buildings that welcomed everyone inside while I quietly convinced myself that I no longer belonged anywhere beyond my work. Friends called me dependable. Coworkers called me brilliant. My sister called me stubborn. She was probably the closest to the truth. I had become an expert at avoiding anything that might crack the carefully reinforced walls around my heart. Then an email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with a subject line that seemed almost too optimistic for someone like me: love beyond barriers. At first I assumed it was another nonprofit requesting free consulting hours, something I often accepted because helping others always felt easier than helping myself. But as I read further, I realized the city was launching its most ambitious accessibility initiative in decades, bringing together architects, attorneys, educators, and community advocates to redesign public spaces so every resident could move through them with dignity. I almost deleted the invitation. My calendar was already full. My life was already full, or at least that was the story I kept repeating. Yet something about those 3 simple words refused to leave me alone. Love beyond barriers. I had no idea that accepting that invitation would introduce me to Claire Sullivan, a woman whose confidence challenged every certainty I had built, whose kindness appeared in the quietest moments, and whose presence would slowly reveal that the strongest foundations are not made of concrete or steel, but of the courage to let someone truly see you. The invitation sat on the corner of my desk for 3 days before I finally accepted it. I wish I could tell you that I felt inspired the moment I clicked the confirmation button, but the truth was far less dramatic. I simply grew tired of finding excuses. By the following Monday morning, I was walking through Boston City Hall carrying a leather portfolio that suddenly felt much heavier than it had during the elevator ride. The conference room overlooked the Charles River, where early spring sunlight danced across the water and reminded me that even familiar places could look different under the right light. Around the long table sat nearly 20 people representing every corner of the project. Engineers, nonprofit directors, educators, city planners, disability advocates, and legal advisors exchanged introductions with a kind of effortless confidence I had always admired from a distance. I quietly chose a seat near the end of the table, hoping to blend into the background until someone needed an architect. That plan lasted less than 60 seconds. "You must be Emily Carter." The voice was warm, calm, and unmistakably confident. I looked up to find a woman extending her hand with an easy smile. Her shoulder-length chestnut hair framed thoughtful green eyes that somehow managed to appear both observant and welcoming at the same time. "Claire Sullivan," she said. "I have admired several of your public library projects. My clients still mention the accessibility redesign in Cambridge." I blinked, genuinely surprised. Most people complimented buildings without remembering who designed them. "Thank you," I replied, shaking her hand. "That means a great deal." Her handshake was steady without trying to prove anything. It lasted only a moment, yet I noticed something unusual. She looked directly at people when they spoke, as though every answer mattered. Before I could think of something intelligent to add, the meeting officially began. For the next 2 hours, Charts covered the presentation screens while discussions moved from transportation to schools, public parks, and historic buildings. I focused on structural possibilities until Claire interrupted one of my proposed layouts with a thoughtful question. Would someone using a mobility device naturally choose that entrance, she asked, or are we asking them to take the longer route simply because it is technically accessible? The room grew quiet. My first instinct was to defend months of preliminary research, but instead I studied the drawing again. She was right. The entrance met every regulation, yet it quietly separated people instead of welcoming them equally. I had not looked at it that way, I admitted. Claire smiled, not because she had won an argument, but because the conversation had moved forward. That difference stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. As everyone packed their laptops, she caught up with me near the hallway. Would you mind grabbing a cup of coffee across the street? She asked. I have a feeling the best ideas rarely happen inside conference rooms. For reasons I could not explain, I found myself saying yes before my cautious side had the chance to interrupt. The coffee shop across the street smelled like freshly ground beans and warm cinnamon, the kind of place where conversations seemed to linger longer than intended. Claire ordered a plain black coffee while I chose my usual latte, silently amused that she somehow looked perfectly comfortable in a crowded cafe filled with students, professionals, and parents chasing energetic toddlers. We found a small table beside the front window where sunlight spilled across the wooden surface, and for a few quiet seconds neither of us said anything. It was not an awkward silence. It felt more like two people deciding whether the stranger across from them might become someone worth knowing. Claire was the first to smile. Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with architecture? She said. I laughed softly. That depends on the question. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before answering. When you design a building, what is the first thing you picture? I expected a conversation about engineering or city regulations, but instead I found myself answering honestly. The person who feels least welcome. If I can make that person feel like they belong, then everyone else usually does too. Claire nodded slowly, as though she had been hoping for exactly that answer. That explains your work, she said. It never feels like someone added accessibility afterward. It feels like everyone was invited from the beginning. I looked down at my cup, suddenly embarrassed by the compliment. It had been years since anyone had described my work in such a personal way. Most clients talked about budgets, deadlines, and awards. Claire talked about people. The conversation drifted naturally after that. We spoke about neighborhoods we loved, favorite bookstores, and the strange comfort of walking along the Charles River after sunset. She told me she had become an attorney because her younger brother had spent most of his childhood navigating a world that constantly underestimated him after a spinal cord injury. Every legal case she accepted carried a piece of that experience. I admitted that architecture had become more than a profession after losing someone I loved because designing spaces that brought people together somehow made the empty places in my own life feel less permanent. Claire did not interrupt or offer comforting words. She simply listened, and somehow that felt even kinder. As we prepared to leave, a sudden spring shower swept across the street, sending pedestrians running beneath awnings with surprised laughter. Claire glanced outside before looking back at me with an amused expression. Looks like we are staying a little longer. I smiled despite myself. I usually plan for everything except the weather. Some of the best moments happen because plans fail, she replied. We watched the rain together while droplets raced down the glass, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons of silver and gold. I realized I had forgotten to check my phone for nearly an hour, something that almost never happened. It was a small detail, almost insignificant, yet it unsettled me in the gentlest possible way. For the first time in years, the carefully organized schedule that defined my life no longer felt like the most interesting thing waiting for me tomorrow. The following week settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, the project team gathered inside a renovated municipal office where walls were covered with maps, sketches, accessibility reports, and handwritten notes collected from community meetings. What surprised me most was not the workload, but how naturally Claire and I kept ending up on the same assignments. Whether we were reviewing sidewalk redesigns, discussing public transportation, or interviewing neighborhood residents, someone always seemed to pair us together. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. By the end of the second week, I realized our project director had noticed that we challenged each other without turning every disagreement into a contest. Claire had an unusual habit of asking questions that forced me to look beyond calculations. During one meeting, I proudly presented a redesigned entrance for a historic library, explaining how every technical requirement had been satisfied. She studied the rendering quietly before asking, "Where would a parent carrying a sleeping child stop to rest if they had already walked 3 blocks?" I searched the drawing and realized there was nowhere to sit. Another afternoon, she pointed toward a wide staircase leading into a neighborhood theater. "If someone uses a wheelchair, which entrance feels like the front door?" Again, I had followed regulations, yet I had missed something more important. Accessibility was not only about reaching a destination. It was about feeling equally welcomed once you arrived. Instead of frustrating me, those conversations became strangely energizing. I began asking different questions before Claire had the chance to ask them herself. She noticed. "You are changing your process," she said one afternoon as we reviewed revised plans spread across a long conference table. I smiled without looking up from the blueprints. "I blame my legal consultant." She laughed softly. "I will happily accept responsibility." We spent more time outside the office as the project expanded. Some mornings we visited schools. Other days we measured sidewalks, examined public parks, or spoke with business owners who shared stories about customers facing everyday obstacles most people never noticed. The city looked different through Claire's eyes. She never rushed past anyone asking for help, and she remembered names after hearing them only once. Watching her interact with complete strangers reminded me that kindness could be as intentional as architecture. One Friday afternoon, after nearly 5 hours of walking through downtown neighborhoods, we stopped beside the Charles River with paper cups of iced tea. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh water, while sailboats drifted quietly beneath the late afternoon sun. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable, almost familiar. Claire finally turned toward me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "when we first met, I thought you were impossible to read." I laughed. "That does not sound like a compliment." "It is not an insult either," she replied with a smile. "Now I think you simply spent a long time protecting yourself." Her words settled gently between us. I wanted to deny them, but something inside me knew she was right. For years, I had designed spaces that invited everyone else inside, while quietly locking the doors to my own heart. Sitting beside the river that afternoon, I found myself wondering when those doors had first begun to open without me even noticing. By the middle of April, the project had become more than a commitment on my calendar. It had quietly woven itself into the rhythm of my days, and, without realizing it, Claire had done the same. I noticed the little things before I noticed the important ones. She always carried extra pens because someone inevitably forgot one. She thanked every receptionist by name. She never interrupted people when they spoke, even when they struggled to find the right words. Those habits revealed more about her than any biography ever could. One Wednesday afternoon, our team hosted a listening session at a neighborhood recreation center. Residents of every age filled the room, sharing stories about cracked sidewalks, inaccessible entrances, confusing signs, and the simple desire to move through their own city without asking for help. I spent nearly 3 hours sketching ideas while Claire carefully documented every suggestion. As the meeting finally ended, I realized how exhausted everyone looked. Volunteers stacked folding chairs while city employees packed presentation boards into storage closets. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the sky, promising rain before evening. Claire leaned against the doorway, rubbing the back of her neck with a tired smile. "I forgot to eat lunch," she admitted. "I think my brain officially stopped working an hour ago." I laughed. "That explains why you almost wrote today's date on your coffee cup instead of your notebook." She looked down at the notebook still tucked beneath her arm and laughed with genuine surprise. "Please tell me nobody noticed." "Only me." We walked toward the parking lot together, where a small family struggled to fold a mobility ramp into the back of their van. Without saying a word, Claire stepped over to help. She did not take over or assume they needed rescuing. She simply asked, "Would another set of hands make this easier?" Within minutes, the ramp was secured, and the grateful parents drove away smiling. Watching that quiet exchange stirred something unexpected inside me. Claire never searched for recognition. She simply noticed people. As we reached my car, the first raindrops began tapping against the windshield. I unlocked the doors and offered, "There is a bakery about 5 minutes from here. They make the best tomato soup in Boston." Since neither of us remembered lunch, I think we have earned dinner. She tilted her head with an amused smile. "Are you inviting me because you enjoy my company, or because you are worried I might accidentally skip another meal?" I pretended to consider the question. Maybe both. The bakery was warm, fragrant, and wonderfully quiet. Rain drummed softly against the windows while we shared soup and fresh bread at a small corner table. There were no blueprints between us, no presentations waiting to be reviewed, no deadlines demanding our attention. We talked about favorite childhood memories, family traditions, and the places we still hope to visit someday. At one point, Claire grew unusually quiet as she looked out at the rain. "You know," she said softly, "people keep thanking me for helping remove barriers around the city. The truth is, I still have a few inside myself that I have never figured out how to cross." I met her eyes without speaking. For the first time since we met, I recognized the same loneliness I had been carrying for years reflected in someone else, and in that quiet moment, the distance between us felt just a little smaller. The days that followed seemed to pass more quickly than the weeks before them, as though our conversations had quietly begun filling the empty spaces between meetings and deadlines. I found myself arriving at the office a few minutes early, without admitting the real reason to myself. Claire usually appeared carrying the same worn leather notebook, a travel mug balanced effortlessly in one hand, greeting everyone with the same genuine warmth whether they were the project director or the security guard downstairs. One Thursday morning, our team visited an elementary school scheduled for a complete accessibility renovation. Children filled the hallways with laughter while teachers walked us through classrooms that had served generations of families. As I measured doorways and examined aging ramps, Claire disappeared into the library where several students were gathered around a large table drawing pictures of what they wished their school could become. When I finished my inspection, I found her sitting beside a young boy who proudly explained that he wanted wider hallways because his grandfather visited every Friday and sometimes struggled with his walker. Claire listened as though his idea belonged in a city planning report instead of a child's drawing. Later, as we walked back toward the parking lot, I asked, "Do you always make people feel like they are the most important person in the room?" She smiled thoughtfully before answering,
"No."
I simply remember what it felt like when someone made my brother feel invisible. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. A few days later, we traveled to a neighborhood on the edge of the city to review an older community center. The elevator unexpectedly stopped working, forcing everyone to climb several flights of stairs carrying presentation boards and equipment. By the time we reached the meeting room, I noticed Claire breathing more heavily than usual. She tried to laugh it off, insisting she had skipped breakfast again, but her face had lost some of its usual color. During the discussion, she remained focused, asking thoughtful questions and encouraging residents to speak openly, yet I could tell she was pushing herself harder than she wanted anyone to notice. When the meeting finally ended, I quietly handed her a bottle of water and the granola bar I always kept in my bag for long workdays. She looked at me with surprised eyes before laughing softly. "You planned ahead again." "Someone has to," I replied with a smile. She accepted both without pretending she did not need them. We sat together on the front steps of the community center while the late afternoon sun settled across the quiet street. After a long silence, Claire looked toward the sky and said, "I spent so many years trying to prove I could handle everything alone that accepting kindness still feels unfamiliar." I understood that feeling more deeply than I wanted to admit. After my husband passed away, I said quietly, people offered help every day. Eventually they stopped asking because I always said I was fine. The truth is, I forgot how to let anyone stand beside me. Claire turned toward me, her expression gentle and sincere. Maybe neither of us forgot, she said. Maybe we were simply waiting until we trusted the right person. I did not answer right away, because the honesty in her words reached somewhere I had spent years protecting. As the breeze carried the scent of blooming trees through the quiet neighborhood, I realized the walls around my heart were no longer falling all at once. They were opening one careful conversation at a time. By early May, our project had moved beyond planning and into the complicated reality of making ideas work in neighborhoods where every street seemed to tell a different story. Construction schedules shifted, funding meetings stretched late into the evening, and unexpected problems appeared almost daily. Strangely, none of it discouraged me the way similar projects once had. Every challenge became another reason for Claire and me to sit across a table covered with sketches, legal documents, and half-finished cups of coffee, while searching for answers together. We developed an easy rhythm without ever talking about it. I anticipated the questions she would ask before presenting a new design, and she began reading my sketches almost as quickly as I could draw them. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for a renovated subway station, I slid a blueprint toward her before she spoke. "There is a wider platform entrance on page 3, I said with a smile. "And yes, every route reaches the same destination without making anyone feel like an afterthought." Claire laughed as she flipped through the pages. "You're getting ahead of me. I have learned from an excellent teacher." She looked up for a brief moment, her expression softening in a way that caught me completely off guard. "I think we have been teaching each other." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the day. A week later, we hosted another community workshop, this time at a neighborhood art center where local residents filled colorful sticky notes with ideas for improving parks, sidewalks, and public buildings. The room buzzed with conversation until an elderly woman slowly approached our table carrying a folded photograph. She explained that her husband had loved taking walks through the city before arthritis gradually limited his mobility. He always said the hardest part was feeling like he was in everyone's way, she told us quietly. Claire reached for the photograph with both hands, studying the smiling couple standing beside the Boston Public Garden many years earlier. I watched her eyes fill with quiet emotion before she thanked the woman for trusting us with such a personal memory. After the event ended and everyone else had left, neither of us hurried to pack our materials. We simply sat in the empty room surrounded by scattered markers and rolled-up maps. "That is why this matters," Claire said softly. "Not because we are changing buildings, because we are changing how people feel inside those buildings." I nodded, realizing she had once again found the truth hidden beneath the technical details. On the drive back toward downtown Boston, the setting sun painted the skyline in shades of gold and amber. We stopped at a riverside overlook before going our separate ways, leaning against the railing while sailboats drifted across the calm water. The city felt unusually quiet. Claire folded her arms against the cool evening breeze before asking, "Do you ever wonder how different life might have been if certain people had crossed your path sooner?" I looked out across the river, considering the question far longer than she probably expected. "Every day," I admitted. "But lately I have started wondering whether people arrive exactly when we are finally ready to see them." Claire did not answer right away. Instead, she smiled with a kind of quiet understanding that needed no explanation, and for the first time in years I found myself looking toward tomorrow with anticipation instead of routine. By the end of May, our schedules had become so intertwined that neither of us needed to ask who would attend the next site visit or who would stay late to prepare for the following morning's presentation. We simply showed up, settled into our familiar rhythm, and somehow made the long days feel shorter. One Thursday evening, after an unexpected round of revisions from the city council, almost everyone had gone home. The office that had buzzed with conversations only hours earlier was now filled with the quiet hum of air conditioning and the soft glow of desk lamps reflecting across rolled blueprints. Claire sat across from me highlighting legal notes while I adjusted the final accessibility layouts for our renovated transit hub. Every so often one of us would slide a document across the table without saying a word because we already knew exactly what the other needed next. It was a strange kind of teamwork, one built less on efficiency than on trust. When I finally leaned back in my chair, I glanced at the clock and laughed. It is almost 9:30. I think we officially forgot dinner again. Claire looked up, surprised by the time. I was about to suggest the same thing, but I was hoping you would not notice first. We packed our papers and walked outside, expecting the mild spring evening we had enjoyed all week. Instead, a steady rain greeted us, turning the sidewalks into shimmering reflections of streetlights and passing cars. We stood beneath the building's entrance, watching people hurry toward taxis with jackets pulled over their heads. "Looks like Boston made the decision for us," Claire said with a smile. "There is no point trying to outrun that." Fortunately, a small diner remained open just around the corner. By the time we reached it, the rain had soaked the edges of our coats despite our best efforts to avoid the puddles. Inside, warm light, quiet music, and the comforting smell of homemade soup welcomed us immediately. We ordered simple meals and found a booth beside the window where raindrops traced slow paths across the glass. Conversation drifted naturally from work to books, favorite places to travel, and the little dreams we had quietly postponed over the years. Claire admitted she had always wanted to spend an entire month driving along the Pacific Coast Highway with no strict itinerary, stopping wherever the scenery invited her. I confessed that I had once dreamed of designing a public library in every state before life slowly convinced me to settle for practical goals instead. She smiled gently. Maybe practical goals keep us safe, but they do not always make us feel alive. Her words lingered long after the waitress cleared our plates. When the rain finally softened, we stepped back outside into cool evening air that smelled wonderfully clean. The sidewalks glistened beneath rows of historic brick buildings while the city seemed quieter than usual. We walked toward the parking garage without rushing, neither of us eager to end the evening. As we reached my car, Claire paused before speaking. "These have become my favorite days," she said softly. "Not because the work is easy, but because I never feel like I am carrying it alone." I met her eyes, feeling something warm settle quietly inside me. "Neither do I." For a brief moment, neither of us moved. The silence was gentle, filled not with uncertainty, but with understanding. Then a distant church bell echoed through the quiet streets, gently reminding us that tomorrow was waiting, and with reluctant smiles we finally said goodnight, each carrying home the comforting realization that our lives had already begun changing in ways neither of us was ready to name. The first week of June brought the kind of sunshine that made Boston feel almost effortless, yet something had quietly shifted beneath the surface of my days. It began with small things that would have gone unnoticed a month earlier. Claire started arriving at meetings a few minutes late, apologizing with a tired smile that never quite reached her eyes. She answered personal phone calls by stepping into empty hallways and returning moments later looking distracted. During conversations, she was still thoughtful, still kind, but every now and then I caught her staring out the window as though part of her attention had drifted somewhere far beyond the city. I told myself everyone carried burdens they did not always share, yet I could not ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me. One afternoon, our team met with neighborhood business owners to finalize accessibility improvements for a busy shopping district. Normally, Claire guided every discussion with calm confidence, encouraging everyone to contribute. That day she spoke less than usual, leaving long pauses where she would normally offer thoughtful observations. When the meeting finally ended, I caught up with her outside. "Are you all right?" I asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "Just a little overwhelmed. It has been one of those weeks." I nodded, accepting the explanation, even though it felt incomplete. "If there is anything I can do, you do not have to carry everything alone." She smiled with genuine gratitude, but there was sadness behind it. "I know. Thank you." For the next several days, she became increasingly difficult to reach. Emails that once received replies within minutes now sat unanswered until the following morning. Lunches we had quietly fallen into the habit of sharing were replaced by brief messages explaining that she had another appointment or needed to leave early. None of those reasons sounded unreasonable, yet together they formed a distance I could not explain. I found myself checking my phone more often than I cared to admit, hoping to see her name appear across the screen. Then, late Friday afternoon, I arrived at the office to find Claire standing near the conference room window holding a folder against her chest. She looked as though she had rehearsed what she was about to say many times before I walked in. "Emily," she began softly, "I need to step away from the project for a while." The words settled over the room with startling weight. "Step away?" I repeated. "For how long?" She lowered her eyes for a brief moment. "I honestly do not know." Questions rushed through my mind faster than I could organize them. Was she leaving because of work? Had something happened to her family? Had I somehow misunderstood everything that had been growing between us over the past months? Before I could ask any of those questions, she continued quietly. "This has nothing to do with you. You have been one of the best things to happen in my life this year. That is exactly why I need some time." She offered a gentle smile that somehow made the moment even more painful. Then she turned, walked down the hallway, and disappeared through the elevator doors before I could find the words that might have convinced her to stay. I remained standing in the silent office, staring at the closed elevator, realizing that sometimes the greatest distance between two people can begin with a goodbye that neither of them truly wanted to say. The office felt strangely unfamiliar without Claire. The same conference room, the same blueprints spread across polished tables, the same steady rhythm of meetings continued day after day, yet every familiar routine reminded me of the one person who was suddenly missing from all of them. I tried convincing myself that work would eventually drown out the questions circling my thoughts, but every draft I completed carried traces of conversations we had shared. Every design decision seemed to echo something she once asked me to reconsider. It was remarkable how deeply someone could shape your perspective without you noticing until they were gone. Nearly 2 weeks passed before I finally accepted that waiting for an explanation was accomplishing nothing. I called her once, leaving a short message that simply said I hoped she was doing well. She never returned the call. I sent a brief email wishing her the best and reminding her that the project team would always welcome her back. That message also remained unanswered. Part of me wanted to respect the distance she had asked for. Another part refused to believe that someone who had become so important could disappear without a reason. One afternoon I stayed behind after a planning session to organize several community surveys Claire had collected before leaving. As I sorted through handwritten notes and interview transcripts, a folded envelope slipped from the back of one folder and landed quietly on the table. It had not been sealed, and my name was written across the front in Claire's careful handwriting. For several moments, I simply stared at it, uncertain whether opening it would be respecting her trust or crossing a boundary she had never intended me to cross. Eventually, I unfolded the single sheet inside. The first sentence immediately took my breath away. "If you are reading this, it means I was not brave enough to tell you the truth face to face." My hands trembled slightly as I continued. Claire explained that several weeks earlier her younger brother had experienced a serious setback related to his long-term medical condition, requiring intensive rehabilitation in another state where their only remaining family lived. She had chosen to keep the situation private because she knew how much the project depended on both of us, and because she feared becoming someone who brought more burdens into my life than joy. Then came the sentence I read over and over again. The hardest part about leaving was not stepping away from the work. It was walking away from someone who made me believe I deserved happiness again. I lowered the letter, unable to think clearly through the rush of emotion filling the quiet room. For months I had assumed Claire was stronger than anyone I had ever met, yet hidden beneath that steady confidence was someone who still believed love had to be sacrificed whenever life became complicated. Suddenly, every canceled lunch, every distracted smile, every unanswered message made heartbreaking sense. She had not walked away because she stopped caring. She had walked away because she cared so deeply that she believed protecting me meant disappearing. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, but this time I held it close instead of placing it back among the paperwork. For years, I had designed buildings that helped people find their way through unfamiliar spaces. Standing alone in that quiet office, I finally understood that the next path I needed to follow was not marked on any blueprint. It led toward Claire, wherever she happened to be, and for the first time in a very long while I knew exactly what I had to do. I left Boston before sunrise the next morning with Claire's letter resting on the passenger seat beside me. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale summer sky, mile after mile carrying me farther from the life I had carefully organized and closer to a future I could no longer ignore. I had called the project director before leaving, expecting resistance after walking away during one of the busiest phases of the initiative. Instead, she surprised me. "Go," she said simply. "Buildings can wait a few days. Some opportunities cannot." Those words stayed with me throughout the drive. 8 hours later, I arrived at a rehabilitation center just outside Albany, New York, where Claire's brother was receiving treatment. The building itself was modest, surrounded by tall maple trees and peaceful walking paths that seemed designed as much for families as for patients. I stood in the lobby for several minutes, suddenly unsure of myself. It was one thing to spend hours imagining this moment during the drive. It was another to realize that a single conversation could change everything between us. Before I had time to lose my courage, I heard a familiar voice thanking a receptionist down the hallway. Claire turned the corner carrying a paper cup of coffee and several folders pressed against her side. She stopped so abruptly that the coffee nearly spilled. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Her green eyes searched my face with equal parts surprise and disbelief. "Emily," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" I held up the envelope she had left behind, following the only map that finally made sense. She looked down at the letter before quietly closing the distance between us. "You were not supposed to find that." I smiled gently. Maybe I was. We walked outside into the afternoon sunshine, finding a quiet bench beneath a large oak tree where families sat nearby enjoying the warm weather. Claire stared across the garden before speaking. "My brother's doing better," she said. "The doctors believe he will recover, but when everything happened, I panicked. I kept thinking that if I allowed myself to become happy with you, life would eventually find a way to take it away. It has happened before." I listened without interrupting because I finally understood that she did not need solutions. She needed someone willing to remain present through uncertainty. "Claire," I said softly, "you once told me that barriers are not always made of concrete. I think we have both spent years building invisible ones around ourselves. Mine was believing I had to face every loss alone. Yours was believing love always asks us to sacrifice it before it can be taken from us." She lowered her eyes as tears quietly gathered, though her smile never disappeared. "I thought leaving would protect you. It only made me realize how much you matter." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above us, while laughter drifted from the nearby garden where patients and families shared the afternoon together. Claire reached for my hand with quiet hesitation, giving me every chance to step away if I wanted to. Instead, I held her hand with calm certainty. Neither of us needed dramatic promises because the choice had already been made somewhere along the journey that brought us here. For the first time, we stopped treating love as something fragile that had to be hidden from life's hardships. Instead, we chose to believe it could become the very reason we were strong enough to face them together. Claire remained in Albany for another week until her brother was strong enough to continue recovering with outpatient care, and during that time we discovered something neither of us had expected. Once we stopped pretending we had to face life alone, even ordinary moments began to feel extraordinary. We shared coffee in the rehabilitation center courtyard before morning therapy sessions, walked beneath tree-lined streets in the quiet evenings, and talked about everything we had once been too cautious to say aloud. There were conversations about childhood dreams, about regrets neither of us could change, and about the strange comfort of finally being understood without needing to explain every scar left by the past. When it was finally time to return to Boston, the drive home felt completely different from the one that had brought me there. Silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried peace. A few days later, we stepped back into the project office together. Conversations briefly paused as colleagues looked up from their desks, surprised to see us arrive side by side. Then smiles spread naturally across the room. No one asked unnecessary questions. Instead, our project director simply walked over, handed Claire a stack of updated meeting notes, and said with a warm grin, "Welcome back. We have been saving your chair." Claire laughed, And for the first time in weeks, I heard the familiar confidence return to her voice. The following month became our busiest yet. Final presentations approached, construction crews completed the last accessibility improvements, and community organizations prepared for the city's official unveiling. We spent long hours reviewing every detail together, but everything felt lighter now because there were no longer invisible walls separating our conversations from our feelings. If one of us felt overwhelmed, the other noticed before a word was spoken. If one of us celebrated a small victory, we celebrated it together. The project itself also seemed to reflect what we had learned personally. Residents who had once believed their concerns would never be heard now walked through redesigned public spaces with quiet pride. Parents pushed strollers alongside wheelchair users without separate entrances. Older adults found comfortable places to rest along sidewalks that had once discouraged them from leaving home. Children raced through parks where every playground feature had been designed for everyone to enjoy together. During one community celebration, the elderly woman who had shown us the faded photograph months earlier approached us once again. This time, she carried a new picture taken only days before. It showed her grandchildren walking beside her through one of the renovated parks, all smiling beneath the summer sun. She placed the photograph in my hands before quietly saying, "You gave my family something I thought we had lost. We belong here again." I looked toward Claire, whose eyes reflected the same emotion I felt but could not quite describe. Later that evening, as we walked along the Charles River beneath a sky painted with soft shades of orange and violet, Claire slipped her hand into mine with complete confidence. "Do you know what surprises me most?" she asked. I smiled. "Tell me." She looked out across the water, where the city lights shimmered like scattered stars. "For years, I believed courage meant standing alone. Now I think real courage is allowing someone to stand beside you." I squeezed her hand gently, realizing that the greatest change in either of us had never appeared on a blueprint or inside a legal document. It had happened quietly, one conversation, one act of trust, and one shared step at a time, until two people who once lived behind carefully guarded hearts finally discovered what it meant to walk forward together. 1 year later, I found myself standing in the very same community center where this journey had quietly begun, but everything around me felt different because I was no longer the same woman who had first walked through those doors carrying nothing but blueprints and carefully guarded silence. The renovated spaces we had imagined together were now filled with life. Children raced across inclusive playgrounds without noticing which equipment had once excluded others. Older couples strolled along smoother sidewalks, pausing on benches thoughtfully placed beneath rows of young maple trees. Parents pushed strollers beside neighbors using wheelchairs, all entering the same buildings through the same welcoming front doors. The changes were visible everywhere, yet the greatest transformation could never be measured in construction reports or architectural drawings. It lived inside the people who finally felt seen. Claire stood beside me as city officials thanked volunteers, engineers, attorneys, architects, educators, and community members whose ideas had shaped the project from the beginning. She looked exactly as she had the first day we met, confident without seeking attention, kind without expecting recognition. Only now I understood the quiet strength behind her smile. When the ceremony ended, families gathered throughout the plaza, laughing, talking, and taking photographs beneath banners celebrating the completion of the initiative. An elderly gentleman approached us using a walker, accompanied by his granddaughter. He smiled warmly before saying, "Today was the first time I entered City Hall through the same front door as everyone else." That may not sound like much to some people, but to me it felt like being welcomed home. After he walked away, neither Claire nor I spoke for several moments. We did not have to. Some victories were simply too meaningful for words. As evening settled across Boston, we wandered toward the Charles River, following the familiar path where so many of our conversations had unfolded months before. The water reflected thousands of shimmering lights, while a gentle summer breeze carried the distant sound of music from a nearby park. Claire looked across the river before turning toward me with the same thoughtful expression that had first challenged the way I saw the world. "Do you remember the question I asked you over coffee?" she said softly. I smiled immediately. You asked what I pictured before designing a building. She nodded. You said you always imagine the person who felt least welcome. I looked around at families enjoying the riverfront together. Now I think about something else too. She tilted her head with quiet curiosity. What is that? I reached for her hand, grateful that neither of us felt the need to hide something so simple anymore. I think about the life we build when we choose not to let fear make our decisions. Claire smiled, her eyes bright with a kind of happiness that grows slowly, honestly, and endures because it has already survived uncertainty. We continued walking without rushing toward any destination, knowing that the most meaningful journeys are never really about arriving somewhere. They are about discovering the people who help us become the version of ourselves we once believed was impossible. Looking back now, I understand that cities are not transformed only by stronger bridges, wider sidewalks, or better buildings. They change because people decide to meet one another with compassion instead of distance, hope instead of fear, and trust instead of silence. That lesson reshaped every drawing I would ever create, every choice I would ever make, and every tomorrow Claire and I would share, proving that the strongest foundation any life can rest upon is a heart finally willing to remain open.